This is the only clip that I have away from the water, but I want you to really pay attention to what this rod tip is doing on the back cast especially, and let's see how that's happening. So here you are already trying to make a much longer stroke than when you first got there, but you can still see how the wrist wants to make that line go down in the back every time, and then it'll pop back up and reset. And a lot of these false casts unroll down in the back, and then because that line is going down like it is right there, you have to come somewhat up in the front to get, so that forward cast is going to unroll 6-8 feet or more above the water, because it's the only way to maintain some kind of loop. So here's your stopping point. There's where you reset, but the line is already headed down. So now you've created a different point where we're going to come forward. It's a little closer, but a lot higher. Then the rod is going to dip down. So now you're dipping it down, but you put a ton of bend in it. There's halfway through the stroke how much lower it is. But then watch how it finishes the stroke. The last little bit of that rod tip is up, 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 up. You can see the line. It's pulling the line up. That loop is going to travel up because the path of that rod tip at the end of the stroke was up. And there's the dip, the soup bowl right there. You can see that underneath the tip of your rod. It copied what your rod tip did. So your rod tip made a big dip below the straight line. And there's the back cast. It bounced down again, but it creates that big right hand angle. Now that's trying to get through the air, but certainly if there's any wind, it's going to cause a huge problem. You're already coming forward and the line is almost on the ground. There's the dip again. So always be looking at the top leg of your loops and see if they are relatively straight or if they have a dip in them. So because your tip bounces down, the top leg of that loop there comes along, and then it makes a right hand angle. Here you can see almost a perfect 90-degree angle between the butt of the rod and your wrist, and you have to close that angle up. So instead of having a short little flip, that is why that front edge of that loop is so big, because your little flicks, fly swat motion, flip, speed up and stop, whatever we want to call it, is a long motion right all the way, all the way, all the way, all the way, all the way. So it's a bigger motion. There's your tailing loop. You see the huge dip in the top leg of that cast. That's copying what your tip is doing. So almost every one of those, it bounces down, resets, then you pull it down, and it dips under, 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 up, up, up. So you can see the leading edge of that loop was headed upward and not down towards the target. So if we can get the leading edge of that loop to go down towards our target, and in the back go up, so there it's so high it's out of the frame, and you're already coming forward, and it's still got 15 plus feet of line that haven't straightened out yet. So that is one reason why you've been forced to use so much power. Here we can see the same bounce down and come back up and reset, and now it dips down. Let's follow the fly leg of that. You see how it's traveling up. The forward edge of that loop was going way up. Now the fly is coming from back down almost on the water in front of you. Here's the path of your tip. And there's the dip in your line that's underneath it, your rod tip right now. There's your tailing loop. But look where that cast started. It barely was behind your head when I started that thing. Here's your backward path. It goes underneath the straight line, and it's going to create another tailing loop right there. Now here's where you're starting your forward cast. It's almost even with your head, and there you put a bunch of extra power in that one, and you really got the tail, and here's where it keeps hitting the water. So now you see how it's hitting the water because that overpressure, the too much power is driving that tip below the straight line. The fly follows below, but the fly is way lower, so it's skirting along the water there on you. Now we're going to follow your path of your tip again. Watch it go under and it finishes going up. So it creates the leading edge of the loop going up, but the back end of that fly line, there's the huge dip, and then you can watch how your leader and your fly flip underneath and almost get the water right there. Then it has to come back up, and right there as it crosses the line, you're in danger of the hook catching on your line. And there's your tail again. So almost every stroke ends up with a tailing loop because the stroke is so short and has a ton of power. Here's a little bit shorter piece of line. Let's see where it's going in the front. So it's still traveling up. And when it straightens out, you see how high that fly is above the water. So here I think you're really attempting to try to get it to go up in the back instead of down so much. This next sequence here, let's watch the tip. It goes up, 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 down, 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 down. So it's not going down as much as it was before, but you see how that the leading edge of that loop was almost a right-hand angle. And there's your tail right there from going too hard forward. Now this one actually flips up better, and it's heading up much, much better there. You got your hand raised up higher, which you don't need to do. We can make it go up with our hand, keeping our hand down. But there, you see the size of that loop. Now the reason that that loop is so big in the front is that is the distance that you're using for your little flick. So from the middle of that loop, top to bottom, 3 feet or so, that's your flick. If you could keep that smaller, we could make that loop a lot smaller as well. You also see what's going to hit first is right there off your tip, and the fly was still well up in the air. I want you to look at these two pictures. Here you can see how narrow that loop is from top to bottom, and it's heading slightly up from my tip because my flip at the end was as wide as the size of that loop. And we come to the end of the forward cast. You see how the top leg of that thing is really straight. It even has a little point on the front of it, but that's the size of the little flip I'm making at the end. My speed up and stop is much shorter than yours is. And there's where you're starting your speed. So your speed comes all at once. There really isn't a drag, 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 drag flip, especially on the front. It's wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. I'm going to go right now. And it's all one fast motion, which makes that bigger, wider, open loop instead of a long drag with a little flip. So that little sidearm drill, especially if you force yourself to drag it ultra slow, at least halfway, you're going to learn how to make a short little flip and not be tempted to make a big long flip that gets you a loop that size. So your flip at the end of your stroke needs to be shorter, but it also needs to be going up in the front and slightly down in the back. But when your tip goes down below and then it ends up going up, it's very hard to get a loop that goes down because the path of your tip is soup bowl shape and not straight line shape. Here's a little bit different angle. I was trying to get there so you could see your hand. That's a much better attempt to pull it back, but you can see how it still wants to flip down on you. So it's going to take a while to get that. Every one of these clips has that same little dip in it because that stroke is so much shorter than it needs to be. It is always pulling that rod tip down and under. You can see that the sudden jolt of power that came, and that's why that loop looked even worse than the one before, but you can see how all of a sudden you applied a ton of power and the rod went from straight. So it's almost straight up over your head now. Now you're really going to have to slam on the power. Boom, a ton of bend. And that big, huge dip right there. The fly almost hit the water again. So now that made it really clear how much extra power you're putting in those strokes. Let's watch how much extra power you put on right away. There's the big dip. Now this really showing how that fly is scooting underneath. There's almost no bend. Your line is not straightened out. You were coming backwards already. All right, here we go from almost nothing. In a very little hand movement, there's a ton of bend. Look how much that rod instantly bent. Instead of gradually bending all the way through, it goes from zero bend to a ton of bend. And that's why that fly is skirting down by the water. This is really going to show it here. No bend, ton of bend, and now it's going to follow, the fly's going to follow what that tip did. Boom, it scoots underneath, almost hit the water. Now it has to flip back up and over. Your line's almost on the water. It is on the water. The fly's still heading out, and it's kind of curved off to the right as well. I want you to watch a couple things here. You can see the pronounced little flip and speed up at the very end of that stroke, and it makes that super narrow loop. Slow, speed up, flip. And right now, see the little flip as that rod unloads. It makes a sudden little flick. So here I want you to look at how much less my rod is bent than yours is. So they're both 7s. Here's the middle of my cast, and now look at some of yours. And that's why my rod tip can stay on that straight line, because it doesn't dip down so much. See that thing pulling that perfectly straight line? It makes that straight cast going forward, and then it unrolls going down. So until you stop adding all that power to it, the rod tip never can go in a straight line. It's never going to be able to go from high to low in a straight line and unroll your right above the target. There's how high your fly is. As you're coming backwards, it's way up above your tip. In the front, well, we want the thing a foot or two above the surface. But that's why it feels impossible to get that thing to unroll going down, because the tip is always going underneath due to so much power generated in such a small zone, because of lots of wrist and not so much hand movement in between the little wrists and one. Little wrist flips and more straight line hand movement in between those two flicks instead of all wrist. I would also recommend you definitely practice without hauling, because a lot of the hauling is causing more problems than it's fixing. So I would practice either one-handed or try not to be pulling on that line at all.